In this portion of the module, we're going to talk about Treisman's work, which started with looking at and examining a very critical question about calculus learners at UC Berkeley and in the 1970s. So some of you who are in STEM disciplines may have heard of Uri Treisman's work. I can tell you that Treisman's work is also applicable in other disciplines like social sciences, humanities, and in other types of disciplines, business. So let's talk a little bit about what Treisman thought about and what problem he was trying to solve when he came up with this work in the 1970s. So the question he asked was, why were African American students, even those with high SAT scores, failing calculus at an incredibly high rate? White students were failing at what he called an acceptable rate, and Asian American students were passing and excelling at a very high rate. So Treisman wanted to study African American calculus students and compare them with Asian American calculus students. And so what he did was, of course, he used what we would say today is a deficit model as to why African American students were failing. So it was based on stereotypes of student success. So he assumed that those who failed across all groups lacked motivation, lacked family support, lacked preparation, time management skills, and study skills. And so what you may have seen at that time, and we sometimes still see, is a tremendous focus on time management, on sort of trying to close the gap, on trying to motivate students, those kind of things. And so those were the primary ways of looking at how to address student success. So he became frustrated because he could not find anything. What he did was he did time motion studies and videotape students. Some of these things you probably wouldn't be able to do today. He got so frustrated that he actually hired anthropology students, so grad students, to follow students around. And so when he analyzed the videotapes and also the notes of the anthropology students who were following groups of African American students around, he found that the students were highly motivated. They went to class, they took notes, they turned in assignments on time. They studied 8 to 10 hours a week, reviewing notes and doing homework. Their families were very supportive. They had sacrificed a lot, including letting their child go to a very white campus at that time. And the students had high SAT scores and generally came from good schools and were of middle-class income, the ones who had ended up at Berkeley. And so all of their hypotheses went out the window. And so then what Treisman did was he did the same sort of studies and had anthropology students follow Asian American students around. And when they analyzed these, what they found was the difference was that Asian American students broke up their study time differently. They organized their study times into periods of lone homework time and then group time around meals or other social times. And so in group time, they compared their homework, argued about answers, and strategized what hard questions might be on the exams. They also discussed each other's grades and shared problems that they had missed before and got help from each other to learn what they had missed. Now that sounds sort of, very ideal in terms of they shared their grades and they shared problems and all this other stuff. But I can tell you stories that are typical and ones that I actually experienced. So back in the 70s when I went to UC Davis, I remember getting a call, my mother calling me, and she was angry at me because another mom had called her and asked why I had not told her son to not be at a party because he had a paper due. And so my mother told me that I better write him because, she didn't want his mother calling her again. Of course, I didn't want my mother calling me again. And so some of it was really sort of, it was really about, oh, you are supposed to keep up with each other and you're supposed to make sure that everyone does their work. And then if you fail or have a hard time, you actually, you ask for help and then you will collectively study together and get that done. So, so what Treisman did is he decided that his hypothesis was that it was this sort of constant comparative method that Asian American students had that was really something was cognitively going on so that students would remember their learning. So you have to defend your answers, or you have to, learn that the way that you strategized, of the strategies you used to solve a problem, was incorrect. Through discussion, you were able to understand how to correct that, and you would remember that better because you had to discuss it, right? So we developed a mentoring program that did not provide typical support in terms of remedial study skills, tutoring, and time management workshops. Instead, it focused on scaffolding and structure for students to do constant comparison of answers and approaches to problem solving. So they had a structure for students to share social time hanging out and doing homework together and studying together in mixed racial teams of peers. And so what he did is, so instead of saying they had to do all of their like 30 problem set together, they would pick out certain ones. Maybe it's problem 1, problem 10, and problem 25. So for 3 problems, after they'd done their homework on a certain day, they would have to meet and sign each other's sheets with signatures to say that they were going to sit down to compare question 1, 10, and 25. And they would write down their answers that they got individually, and then they would actually do a comparison and argue for what they thought was the right method. If they couldn't figure it out, they would consult with their notes. They might ask a TA or other people. So students in the Treisman Math Study Group outperformed across all racial and ethnic groups at Berkeley, even though the students spent similar amounts of time studying. The retention rates for these students were also off the charts compared to students who are not in the study group. So we can apply Treisman's work across disciplines, and it indeed has been applied successfully even until now. There's still a center at UT Austin that looks at Treisman's work. And so that what we know is that collaborative learning needs to be structured not only in the classroom, but also outside of the classroom. So setting up a peer group of learners is important. And in that peer learning, what they should do is they need to strategize on how to sequence lone learning and group learning, right? So you can provide sort of the structure for it through, required structure that they do, and that it should be a constant comparative and iterative process. Such you can use like polling and comparing answers to other responses. You can have them do it maybe on Google Docs, for example. And so we need to sort of think about, how do we get students to do their own work on some of the work, but then also encourage collaborative comparison. And that's where the key learning and integration of concepts and learning, and then also applying that learning to other problems and other problem sets will occur. So I'm going to talk about a way to adapt the math model to something like a course in social sciences. And so Craig right now is going to share a worksheet or a cover sheet that I used in my teaching. And so this is from a course that I taught on gender and communication. And so what I had take-home exams for students that were quite hard. They were, because they're going to be take home, they were actually harder to do. But I would give them time in class, and you could do this in breakout rooms, for example, on Zoom, or they could arrange their own Zoom, to do this. But what was required is that students in groups of 4, so in the case I had groups of 4, and it could be up to 5, would commit. So they have to sign paper. They would commit to studying together to come up with concepts, to come up with, identifying examples within the material they were given, like articles they were given to read, so that they would come up with a plan on how they would write 4 essays. And they were given 7 essays sometimes, or 8 essays to pick from. So they've got 5 different articles or 6 different articles, then they might have to only produce essays on 3 of them. But they should all study together for all of them. And so what the students do is they are committing to also prepare each other so that everybody has all of the notes, all of the readings, and key concepts and core materials in order to do the work. So this is where students are encouraged and should be checking in and say, were you absent for a class? I have the lecture notes, right? Maybe there was an assigned video that you didn't watch. Here, I'm going to give you a link so that you can watch it. And so they're responsible for helping each other get to the point where they're prepared. And then what they do is their own original writing, right? And so it can seem like that, you're encouraging, academic misconduct, but in fact, students really learn through discussion about the concepts and the ideal passages to attach those concepts to. They actually learn it in a very integrated way through constant comparison. right? So I come up with a list of concepts that I think are best for this article. Someone else will come up with a list of concepts. There may be some overlap and not. So from looking at each other's work, we're able to learn, right? And so what I can say is that once I started using this Treisman-based way of doing the assignments, what I found was the quality of the work for my students, and in their non-take-home final essay, in-class essay, the quality of the work for my students went up significantly. I used to dread reading papers, as some of you might. In a class of 30, there might be 5 essays that are just really, really hard to read, and maybe even more because of the quality. But when I started using this, it really raised the level of performance of students. And it's because, again, they're integrating learning through discussion, or sort of structured discussion, so that it's easier for them to write, and the writing becomes more fluent in terms of understanding the concepts.